Hi, I'm Joseph Murphy, and welcome to Alien Brain Fog, a science-based podcast focused on memory, identity, and the systems of oppression that affect both. How do you know who you really are? If an alien walks into your mall and robs your store, can you charge him with theft?
For the first time in our history, a federal appeals court is tasked with ruling on whether a president is above the law.
Are certain people like Donald Trump above the law, or have they just fooled themselves? Both of these questions can be answered by looking at the rule of law. What is it? Who does it apply to? And more importantly, do we currently live under the rule of law, or are we fooling ourselves?
Long COVID and medical gaslighting.
It's an ontological crisis.
I don't even see color. Are aliens real?
Here's the agenda for today's podcast and what we'll learn. We'll start by establishing what we mean by the rule of law. What is it and who does it apply to? We'll also look at some historical examples to show it hasn't always applied to everyone. Finally, we'll look at what does the rule of law have to do with you? How does a sense of law and order affect your sense of who you are and what you are? Now, recently, Donald Trump had a court case postponed while the courts determined if or if not he had immunity. Now, immunity to what, you might ask? The law. It is Donald Trump's belief that he is immune to the law, meaning he is immune to the consequences of his actions. So, is that true? The courts don't think so.
We have breaking news. The D.C. Court of Appeals has ruled unanimously that former President Trump is not immune from criminal prosecution in the federal election interference case.
Fair warning. This next bit does involve a little bit of history, but I think it's important for us to know our past. That's how our brains work, our memories. They remember what happened in the past so it can help us predict what's going to happen in the future, which may be why certain groups of people want to ban books and tell you that people educated in history are the enemy. Now, our history in the West is complex. We have not always been run by the rule of law, even when we said we were. In the past, the rich and those from certain bloodlines were held above the law. It's almost like you're a hockey player in Canada. Basically, your degree of economic power determined whether or not the law applied to you. So, a very brief history of Western law. I know some people are obsessed with the Roman Empire these days, so let's start there. The Roman people understood that without the law, people would be at the mercy of violent men. Now, the Romans believed that without law, civilization would collapse. So they codified the law, meaning they put it in writing, and, at least in theory, made sure that everyone followed it. Game of Thrones was fiction, but the behavior of the ruling class was pretty historically accurate. Now, at one point, people were led to believe that their rulers were chosen by God, meaning to question your ruler was to question God, which meant that you were a demon and should be unalived. Now, in 1215, England made the bold move to put in writing that maybe the king wasn't above the law. Maybe nobody was above the law. This is what we mean by rule of law, that everyone is ruled by the law and that the law is supreme. Not the king, not a person, the law. Because the law applies to everyone. The Magna Carta also gave us other rights. It prevented unlawful imprisonment. Prior to that, you could be arrested and thrown in jail without charges or a trial, kind of like the Patriot Act. The English Bill of Rights was passed in 1689. Now, it allowed the election of representatives without royal approval, and it prevented royals from interfering with the law. Because your leadership is not supposed to interfere with the way you vote, like they currently do with gerrymandering. In Canada, we have something called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was included in our Constitution Act of 1982. Now, this gave the courts the power to strike down laws that were unconstitutional. So what does that mean? In Canada, no law can be passed that contradicts your human rights, meaning the rights you have because you were born a human being. Now, in emergency cases like war, the government can temporarily ignore some of your rights and freedoms, but it has to prove it's necessary. There's also something called the notwithstanding clause. Now, this allows Freudian slip. This allows lawmakers to break the law temporarily and ignore our constitutional freedoms.
Alberta's new plans for trans youth are making headlines across the country.
The most anti-LGBT policies of anywhere in the country.
But again, it's only for a limited time. Now, in Canada, the government can limit our rights, but it has to prove there is a need to, because the law has more power than people. Trump, Trudeau. Now, both of these men are loved by few and hated by many, but are they the same? I mean, Trump, he incites an insurrection. He's found guilty of sexual assault, found guilty of fraud. He took money from foreign leaders while he was in office, misappropriated classified documents. And he's currently telling the world that he will become a dictator and turn America into a fully Christian theocracy ruled by him, the second coming of Christ. And there are a certain group of people who believe he has been sent by God. It appears that they have decided he is above the law. I have a friend with a DUI who can't cross the border, but Trump gets to run for office and command armies? Meanwhile, in Canada, Trudeau used something called the Emergencies Measure Act. He did that to break up a disruptive event in Ottawa that began as a protest but turned into a circus. Now, the courts ruled that the government exceeded their authority, meaning that the leaders in Canada do not have the right to do whatever they want, like it appears they do in the United States. Now, this would give the appearance that the rule of law has more effect in Canada right now than it does in the United States, because a growing number of Americans seem convinced that the rule of law does not apply equally to everyone. So, who does the rule of law apply to? The easy answer is everyone. Every human being is seen as equal under the law, meaning that no one person has more or less rights than another person, and no person is more or less protected by the law than another person. Why would rulers be willing to give so much freedom to their citizens? The answer is simple. History. We know what happens when leaders don't. To understand that better, let's look at France, 1789 to 1799, a period we now call the French Revolution. Now, prior to the Revolution, the people of France lived under a system called feudalism. You can look at the Wikipedia page for feudalism, but it boils down to this. Feudalism was a system in which all of the land was owned by a few people called lords, and all of the work was being done by peasants, who were given a place to live in exchange for all of their work. The peasants grew to believe that the lords of the land, or landlords, had more rights than they, the peasants, did, which is a problem. One of many. Let's look at a few key causes for the French Revolution. Now, the feudal system had created unsustainable income inequality. This led to widespread famine, death, starvation. Now, the average person was not sure where their next meal was coming from. And at the same time, the upper class were living a very lavish lifestyle, royal absolutism. Now, those in power, the royals, could overrule any law. Now, in effect, a crime was not a crime if a royal said it wasn't a crime. which meant that members of the royal family could do anything that they wanted to, while peasants were held accountable for minor infractions, like stealing food to live. They also had noble privilege. Social preference was given to those of higher birth, meaning people from certain bloodlines, rather than people that worked hard. Now, it didn't matter how hard you worked, only who your parents were. No amount of hard work would bring you to wealth. We also had clerical privilege. We forget now the power the church once held over people. Now, the fear of eternal damnation and torture can be very persuasive. During the revolution, the church was essentially taken over by the government and made accountable to the people, not the Vatican. Once upon a time, the church was held above the law. If you were a priest, you could do anything you wanted to and face no consequences. Thankfully, that's very different now. The final straw was bifurcation. Humans were placed into one of two groups. You were either the working class, a peasant, or the ruling class, a landlord. Now, this created two levels of personhood. Now, while the rule of law applied to all persons, maybe some humans weren't people. Because if you can convince enough peasants that a group of humans are not people, well, then the rule of law doesn't apply to them. Now, faced with the evidence of their eyes and ears, the peasants realized that the wealthy had taken advantage of them. And if they didn't act, the peasants' children would have no hope for the future. So they rose up. It was messy. Messy. This is why it is so important for civilizations to follow the rule of law. If the general population believes that the people in power aren't following the rule of law, then they won't either. It is essential for the stability of democracy that everyone believes the rule of law is in effect. Historical exceptions to the rule of law. Now, earlier, I asked, if an alien robbed your store at the mall, could you charge him with theft? Well, the answer is no, because the law currently only applies to humans, people. Now, for the same reason, if a squirrel steals an apple in your backyard, you don't call the police. You take the law into your own hand, you pick up a rock, and you throw it at him. Now, historically, there have been other groups of people, aside from aliens, that were seen as not human, and therefore not protected by the rule of law. Let's look at a few examples. Indigenous people.
It is a story of forced assimilation and physical, emotional, and sexual abuse.
For more than a century, the children of Canadian Native communities, including what's known as the First Nations, were taken from their families and sent to Christian boarding schools run for the government, about 70% of them run by the Catholic Church. An estimated 150,000 children passed through these schools before they were closed in 1996. They were banned from speaking their languages or practicing their traditions. Children died and their families were never told, their bodies never returned.
How could followers of Christ take a child from their home, assault them, neglect them, all while believing they were doing God's work? Now, if the children were seen as human, that would never have happened. Instead, they were seen as Now, that is a dehumanizing word, literally a word to remove humanity from a person. When we teach our society that a group of people, like Indigenous people around the world, are less than us, meaning they are less educated, less civilized, less worthy, it sends a message. Certain people hear that. Since this group is not quite human, they are fair game. Now, it is against the law to unalive a human. Now, the racial background of that human should have zero impact on the degree to which that crime is investigated. And yet Canada has a problem. Indigenous people, especially Indigenous women, are not safe here. That's not a judgment call, that's just looking at reality. Because the way Canadian society reacts when an Indigenous person is unalived is very, very different than when a white person is unalived. Now we can all see that. So maybe we should stop denying reality and change that. This part is unscripted. I'm just going to speak freely. In the time since I originally wrote the script and I'm filming now, the Supreme Court of Canada just made a very major decision. I feel like maybe we've turned a corner. I'm trying not to rant. All I need to say is the Supreme Court of Canada made a decision. It has given a lot more authority and autonomy to the Indigenous people of Canada. And it's just another sign that the rule of law actually does mean something here. Back to the script. Let's look at another group that the law historically did not protect. October 18th, 1928. That is the day women in Canada were finally considered persons. We celebrate the fact that it's been less than 100 years that we men have acknowledged that women are sentient beings. This is not something to celebrate. Math states that women make up roughly 50% of the population. Sometimes they are the majority, which means that for most of written history, the law has not protected more than half of humanity. It was not until 1960 that all women could vote in Canada. The last group of women given the right to vote? Indigenous women. I know. Shocking. In 1971, we passed a law in Canada guaranteeing that women would receive equal pay for equal work. Now that's the year I was born, so I can tell you that it has been 52 years and women are still not getting paid the same amount for the same work. It's almost like the law is not being followed. Much of the reason for the subjugation of women has been the church. Society deemed women were not equal to men because the Bible said it was true. And if you disagreed with the Bible, you were a demon. Men were doing nothing wrong by taking control of women. They were just doing God's will. Remember, this podcast deals with gaslighting. Now let's look at another group of humans that were historically not considered people. Black people. Me as a black person with one white parent and one black parent. Now there are many people in the world who do not see me as human. I am an abomination. And not just because I'm gay. There are many people believe that because of the color of my skin, having a relationship with me is like having a relationship with a dog. In fact, if they had to choose between saving the life of a black stranger or a dog they have never met, they would save the dog and see nothing wrong with that because the dog to them is more human than a black person.
The Jim Crow era was marked by a reign of domestic terror known as lynching, a grotesque form of mob rule without judge or jury. Decades of hangings used as a way to terrorize black people. The last documented lynching in the United States took place 26 years after Emmett Till was murdered. In 1981, Michael Donald was attacked at random by two members of the Ku Klux Klan. He was beaten, then strangled, and hanged.
Lynching only became a federal crime in the United States in March of 2022. It hasn't even been 2 years. And you really expect black people to believe that they are fully protected by the rule of law in the United States? It hasn't been 2 years. You expect women to believe they will be fully compensated for their work when Greta Gerwig and Margot Robbie are still in the news for being snubbed at the Oscar, when we are still seeing women who are not paid equally for their work, and it's been 52 years since the law said that that was not allowed. Now here is where it starts to play with your sense of who and what you are. If a group of people is not protected by the rule of law, why would they follow the rule of law? Let's say that a different way. An alien walks into a store in a mall in Miami and buys a dress. The minute the alien leaves, the store owner says, "Stop, thief. That alien stole my dress." Now, the law sees the human as a human and an alien is not. Therefore, the human is always right because the human is protected by the law and the alien is not. Therefore, the alien must have stolen from the human. The alien must be lying. The alien goes to jail. Now, after this, why would the alien ever buy from your store again? They might as well steal if they're going to be blamed for it anyway. Sadly, there are standard ways around the rule of law. They are often very effective. So why do people ignore the rule of law? Almost always, greed. Let's say, for example, that you are a person in power and there is something that you want, like land. If a group of people has something that you want, you can't just take it. That's against the law. But hear me out. What if you can convince enough of your followers that a group of people aren't people after all? You dehumanize them. You dehumanize them by calling them s***. Or you say that women can't decide what to do with their own bodies because you know how women are, wink wink, overly emotional. They need a man to come in and take charge with his big logical man brain because it says so in the Bible. Now, historically, when people come together to overturn the rule of law, it has not been good, especially for minorities. Imagine if everyone came together tomorrow and said, we need to redivide wealth in the nation. We're going to give all the wealth to right-handed people, and no left-handed person will be able to accumulate wealth. Now, if you put that to a vote, left-handed people would be condemned to a life of poverty because the will of the majority decided to overturn the rule of law for their benefit. Let's take it a step further. The church gives left-handed people a name, sinisters. Did you know the word sinister comes from the Latin word for left? And that in magic, the left-hand path is the most dangerous dark magic. What is it that left-handed people are hiding? We can laugh about it today because we know it's silly. We know there's no difference between your people that use their right hand or people that use their left hand. It was a silly superstition, but it wasn't that long ago. There are people alive today who very well remember being hit when they tried to write with their left hand. There are also many people alive today who remember a time when women could not open up a bank account or get a credit card. There are many gray-haired old men who still remember a time when they could assault their wives and children and face no consequence. They remember a time when they could smack the uppity boy with the brown skin and everyone would understand. Those people are still here and they are still in power. And that needs to change. A little bit off script. Donald Trump has just welcomed Russia to attack NATO and start World War III. I'm not one to make wild accusations, but I think it's pretty clear at this point that Trump is not working for America. Put up as the leader of his country, who is actively calling for Putin to ignore international law. And they still want him to be the ruler. So, meaning you want someone who doesn't care about international law to be in charge of your country, United States. But I'll move on. The minute you see one group of people dehumanizing another, stop. Ask yourself, why? Why are they trying to remove the humanity of this group of people? They have to dehumanize them because they can't call them what they really are, an inconvenient obstacle in their desire to ignore the rule of law. Now, the most important thing for the stability of any democracy is the appearance that the rule of law is being maintained. When enough people believe that the system is rigged, that the system does not protect them, when enough people believe that, well, then we have problems with social stability.
With Europe's farmers, because as you've been hearing, protests that began in France and then Germany have been spreading across the continent. Demonstrations are taking place in Poland, Hungary and Italy today. The farmers venting their anger over soaring fuel and fertilizer costs.
A reminder of the events that caused the French Revolution. Poverty, royal absolutism, noble privilege, clerical privilege, and bifurcation into peasants and landlords. Look, I'm not trying to predict the future. I'm just looking at historical events and saying they look pretty close to what's happening right now. Draw your own conclusions. The rule of law is not the only way to organize a society. Let's look at a few options. Anarchy. This would be every person for themselves. Without the rule of law, the world would devolve into kind of a post-apocalyptic nightmare. Now, if you've seen or played The Last of Us, this would be life outside one of the protected cities. Anarchy. You also have the divine right of kings. In this case, you have a ruler or a group of rulers who have convinced people that they are chosen by God. And everything they say and do is interpreted as the will of God. Divine right of kings. Now, speaking of men who abuse women and think they're God, Trump. Now, history is really clear. What happens when men like Trump get unlimited power? So, can we seriously not let that happen? Like, seriously. Now, we also have plutocracy. Now, this has nothing to do with the planet and everything to do with the Greek god of the underworld. He was also called Hades, but at one point, people were too afraid to say the name Hades, so they called him Pluto, the wealthy one. Under a plutocracy, the more wealth you have, the more you can ignore the rule of law. That means with enough money, you can do anything you want and face no consequence. Mob rule. Now, this is when a group of people decides to take the law into their own hands, and the law is whatever the group says is the law. And it can change at any time depending on who the group is.
I think about watching an alien movie. You can kind of watch and laugh and think it's kind of interesting or fun, but it's so absurd, it's not going to happen, so you can kind of involve yourself in the story. And then I watched this trailer, and it made me oddly uncomfortable because it was just seemed a little too possible.
We're having a sort of a pre-Civil War geographical force multiplier. We have this red-blue state now, and we're becoming geographically defined as well as ideologically. We are retribalizing in this country where a person's first allegiance is to his superficial appearance, which used to be incidental, not essential to who we are. But we're all branding ourselves as in a geographical sense and in a racial or tribal sense. And
so, do we currently live under the rule of law? Well, that depends on who you are and where you live. So no, we do not currently live under the rule of law. In my opinion, we live in a plutocracy where those with the most money can do anything they want. They don't have to follow the law. I mean, if they're caught, they pay a small fine, but because they have so much money, that fine is not a disincentive for them to not do crime. No matter what the powerful do, they don't go to jail. And jail is only for poor people. Now, I would like to be proven wrong, but I can see reality, and I think you can too. We need to stop pretending that everything is okay. So, what do we do about it? It's easy. We fix it. Now, how? Also easy. We hold the powerful to account. That's it. Hold the powerful to account. We need at least the appearance of fair play. Because if the powerful stop pretending that the rule of law applies to them, my fear is so will the rest of the country. And that won't be good for anyone. We do not currently live under the rule of law, but we aspire to. The law is not perfect, but it is the best tool we have to maintain a safe and stable democracy. So, what does all of this have to do with you? Now, you have grown up in a system that clearly demonstrates some people have more rights than others. Our educational system, our political system, and especially our religious systems have taught us that some people are more deserving than others. If you grew up in the West, those things are in your brain. They influence the way you think and the way you act, whether or not you are conscious of it, because it has all been part of our programming. In many ways, you are who you think you are. And some of the things you think about yourself are not you. Now, some of the things you think are you are actually your culture or your upbringing. You might not see the difference, but it can show up in your body. Oppression and trauma show up in your bodies, even if you are not conscious of it. So let's look at the way that your thoughts can actually affect your body. Now, many of you have seen this image before. It's a hierarchy of needs. It represents the order in which we need to secure things to have a safe and stable environment. Meaning that before you can manifest your biggest dreams, you have to have shelter and food. Similarly, before you have a sense of connectedness, you have to feel safe in your environment. You need a stable environment, which gives you the power to achieve the other steps. So what if you don't feel safe? If you are constantly worried about your physiological and economic safety, it's kind of hard for you to reach self-esteem. That is what we have done to Indigenous people, to women, to visible minorities, and as we'll discuss in a later episode, people living with disabilities. And it is intentional. It's not accidental. It is intentional. Because the people running the plutocracy realize something that we don't. As soon as the women and the visible minorities and the Indigenous people come together, it is all over for the people running the plutocracy. Which is why they kind of want the peasants to keep fighting amongst themselves. They're telling you that there is a culture war, and the only culture war happening right now is class warfare. Ruling class versus the peasants. But I'll move on. Now, how does fear show up in the body? Now, I'm going to show you a graphic that is going to annoy some people, but stay with me. Remember, not everything can currently be explained by science. Chakras. Now, chakra work is magic. It is not science. Remember, with science, something is true whether you believe it or not, like gravity. It's just science. Magic needs you to believe in it before it works. In my experience, chakras in the body tend to align with hierarchy of needs. Anxiety is a first chakra issue. Anxiety is often tied to trauma related to unfulfilled security needs. If people can't secure food and housing, you can expect anxiety rates to rise. Anxiety rates can be reduced by ensuring all physical needs are met. Science says that chakras do not exist because we don't have the technology to test if they exist. Our current technology can't see them, but maybe our bodies can. Why do you feel the way you feel? Do you feel anxious, depressed, unsure of the future? Now, unless you've done a lot of self-analysis, you probably don't know why you feel the way you feel. You probably believe that's just who you are. Your personality is just who you are.
Self-esteem, I became interested in it when I started to teach workshops on intuition. And then I recognized that in fact they were so intuitive it was driving them nuts, that in fact everybody is. The drawback was that they didn't have enough self-esteem to follow their intuitive hunches. They didn't have enough regard for themselves, enough sense of their own strength to follow what their gut instinct was saying to them. Now, how do you get that? Obviously, Corinne, this is not a product that can be bought. I don't believe that you can get self-esteem by meditation I think meditation can help you perhaps get in contact with the courage you need to actually make changes that reflect your faith in yourself. Theory does not heal, action does.
When I was recovering from COVID, one thing saved me. It's a book written by Carolyn Mace many years ago called Why People Don't Heal and How They Can. And it talked about how trauma showed up in the body. Now, I'm a very science-minded person, so I read the book, put it in the back of my mind, and then I got sick many, many years later and decided to put it into practice. And I found that dealing with trauma led to physical changes in my body, which is annoying, because that shouldn't happen, right? But it did. And it got me thinking, maybe we don't understand our bodies fully. And then I started looking at current science and realized, no, we do not know how our bodies work. And that the science of today is very, very different than the science when I was in high school, which is why I think a lot of people are very confused about many, many topics. I'll end with this. The world is very messed up right now, and I have a feeling it's about to get a lot darker pretty quickly. But what do? The most revolutionary thing you can do, it's not taking to the streets. It's not yelling at someone on social media, and it's absolutely not violence. We need to evolve past that. The most revolutionary thing that you can do is to meditate. Seriously, meditate. Sit in a dark room, quiet your mind, and get to know who you are. Examine your beliefs. Now, we live in an age when people are so quick to say, I believe this and I believe that. Stop and ask yourself why. Why do you believe the things you believe? Take the time to think about that. Because the people running the plutocracy, they don't want you to think. COVID made us sit in our rooms and think. And a lot of us realized, wait a minute, something here doesn't add up. And we need more of that, which means we need less people taking to the streets and yelling on social media, and more people growing up, meditating, and figuring out who they are. Next time on Alien Brain Fog, we'll look at tribalism. Why do we feel the need to attach ourselves to a collective? Why do our brains assign people we meet to groups? And more importantly, how can we determine if our actions are actually the conscious actions of ourself or the unconscious actions of someone just trying to remain part of the collective? Thank you for joining me. Be kind. The world's really messed up right now.